Masechet Horayot, Daf Daled. We begin with the Mishnah on Daf Gimel Amud Bet. Horu betin v'yad'u sheta'u v'chazru bahen ben she'hevi'u kaparatan uben shelo hevi'u kaparatan v'halach v'asa al pihem Rabbi Shimon poter v'Rabbi Elazar omer safek. If a bet din issued a mistaken ruling, and then they realized that this was a mistaken ruling. At first they said that chaleb is kosher, and then they realized that it's not true, and they changed their minds. And that means they made an announcement, and they said, oh, last week when we said that this chaleb is kosher, that was a mistake. In fact, it's not kosher. Now, it doesn't matter whether they actually brought a korban, if the majority of the people followed that ruling and ate such chaleb, they would have to bring a korban. And so whether they actually brought the korban or did not yet bring the korban, that will not matter for this next halacha. If someone goes ahead and follows their ruling after they retracted it, apparently he didn't hear the announcement that said that actually we were wrong and actually this is not kosher. He heard the original announcement that this chaleb is kosher, and a week later, the Bet Din changed their minds. He didn't hear the second announcement, and this guy went ahead and ate it, thinking it was kosher, relying on the original permission. Rabbi Shimon, that's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, says the individual is patur because he was still relying on the Bet Din. It's true that the Bet Din retracted, but he didn't know that. So he assumed that this is still kosher. Sometimes it happens that something can get a kosher mark on it, and then the hashgacha, they publish in the paper or in their magazine or online, they say, oh, that was a mistake. Actually, that product is not kosher. We have to change it. So he didn't hear about it. And so it's not his fault. He's still relying on Bet Din. Now, it's true that once the Bet Din changes its mind, even if most people didn't hear about it and follow it, the Bet Din will not have to bring a korban after that because they already changed their ruling. So they don't have to. But according to the Rabbi Shimon, the petur on the individual not to have to bring a korban is not dependent on the fact that the Bet Din does bring a korban. The Bet Din would not bring a korban on his behalf, and he doesn't have to bring korban either because he is still relying on Bet Din because he didn't hear about the retraction. However, Rabbi Elazar says safek. So what does that mean, safek? We're going to explain. He's going to have to bring an asham talui. That's a korban that where one is not sure if one sinned or didn't sin. So you bring an asham talui until you can figure out whether if for sure one sinned by mistake, then you would bring a korban chatat after that. Now, ezehu safek, what do you mean safek? What's the uncertainty? In other words, it depends. Another interpretation of safek here is that it depends. So what does it depend on? Yashav lo betoch beto hayav, halach lo lemedinat hayam patur. If this guy was sitting at home, then he actually has to bring let's say asham talui, because he's sitting at home. He should know better. He could go outside and listen to the news. He's home in his city. But if he went overseas on a trip, then he's not going to hear the local news that the Bet Din said retracted. He's far away. He's on a ship. And so he is assuming the last thing he heard when he was back home was that this chaleb is permitted. And so he took some on his trip with him or found somewhere he was and ate it. So in that case, he's relying on the original ruling, and he didn't have a practical way of hearing about the retraction. So then he doesn't have to bring anything. But if he could have heard it, then he's going to have to bring a korban. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Modani bazeh shu karov liftor min hachova. Rabbi Akiva says, I agree regarding this, that a person who relies on the original ruling and didn't hear about the retraction, that is closer to someone who is patur. Rabbi Akiva is referring to someone who goes overseas. He says that makes sense. Although, I mean, you want to just update every once in a while and see if this is really kosher. But since he's overseas, it makes sense that he would not be liable to bring any korban. Amalu ben Azai, Maishin Azai min hayoshe bebeto. Ben Azai says, what's the difference where he is? What's the difference if he's away or if he's at home? In other words, according to Ben Azai, he's relying on a ruling, but that ruling doesn't exist anymore. So let him bring a korban. A korban, chatat, after all, is for someone who makes a mistake. Someone made a mistake and they thought this was this was kosher fat. In fact, it was chelib. Just a regular case like that. Okay, he made a mistake. So here, there is no ruling. The ruling was retracted. This guy made a mistake. Okay, so let him bring a korban. What's the difference where he is? He's relying on something that doesn't exist. So for Ben Azai, he should be liable to bring a korban. But Rabbi Akiva answers, no, it's different. The person who's sitting at home, it's possible that he could hear about the retraction. It makes sense. Like, what you're sitting in your home, you don't listen to any news, you don't hear the announcements that are going on outside. So then, if you're home, you have to bring a korban. You're responsible. If you're away, there's no possibility that he could have heard the court's reversal, and therefore we can say, okay, you're still relying on the original ruling of the court. The Mishnah continues with a completely different subject now. And he says, if the Bet Din gives a mistaken ruling that uproots an entire mitzvah, for example, Amru en nida batorah, en Shabbat batorah, en avodah zarah batorah, hare elu peturin. They say there's no such law as the nida. The whole concept of nida, we'll see, applies to zava also. There's no such thing. Or they say there's no such thing as Shabbat. Shabbat's not a day. There's no such thing. There's no prohibition on idolatry in the Torah. You're allowed to do idolatry. If they issue a ruling like that, they'd have to be a really pretty incompetent court to be able to do that. But let's say you're in some time and place in history when there were some times when courts were made up of sectarians or people that were very incompetent. Let's say they said something like that, and people followed it. The court is not liable. Why? Because the people should know better. Anybody who just has a basic knowledge of Parashat HaShavua, you know that there's Shabbat, you know that there's Nidah and idolatry, there's 10 commandments. So you have to know these things. If a court says, oh, idolatry is allowed, everybody will know, what's wrong with this court? That's not right. I'm not going to follow that. So you have to know better. Therefore, the people are responsible for themselves if it's something so explicit and it's a whole law. And since the people are responsible for themselves, the Bet Din is not responsible for his communal offering. However, if the Bet Din made a ruling that uprooted part of a mitzvah, but part of the mitzvah remains, then they are liable. Because there it's possible, we'll see examples, this melacha is permitted, that melacha is prohibited. So then the people will say, I guess, okay, the Bet Din said so, I guess they know what they're talking about. So then the people will rely on the Bet Din, and it's not hard for them to know better. So then the Bet Din is responsible to bring a korban. Kesar, what's an example? Amru yesh nida b'torah v'halaba shemet yom keneged yom patur. They said there is such a law as nida and zava also. Nida is when a woman sees blood during her expected time of her period. Zava is when she sees blood not at the expected time of her period. If she is a zava, if it's 3 days that she sees blood, then she's going to be a zava gedolah. She has to wait 7 clean days in order to become tahor. But if she sees blood only 1 day or only 2 days, then she only needs to check herself the next day for 1 day to make sure that the blood does not continue. And as long as she does that, she can go to the mikveh and she will be clean the next day. Now that day that she is waiting, so the day that she saw blood, the rest of that day she can't be with her husband. And the next day while she's waiting to check, that's shomeret yom, she's observing for 1 day, corresponding to 1 day that she saw blood. So that second day when she's observing to make sure that she doesn't bleed any further, she's not allowed to be with her husband that day either. Now, what if a Bet Din says, the laws of Nidah, the laws of Zavah, they're in the Torah, they're definitely there, but they rule mistakenly, and they say that someone who is waiting 1 day because she saw blood the previous day, let's say they say she's allowed to be with her husband, but that's not true. But the people don't know, and they follow this ruling, that Bet Din is liable because they only talked about a part of a mitzvah, not the whole mitzvah. Another example, Yesh Shabbat b'Torah v'ala mosim reshut ha'yachid reshut harabim patur. If the Bet Din says, listen, there is such a thing as laws of Shabbat, but if you carry something from private domain to a public domain, patur, they say you're allowed to carry. That's wrong. Now the people they know there's Shabbat, there's such a thing as Shabbat, and they know you can't do melacha and you can't farm, but people don't know every detail, and the Bet Din says there is Shabbat, but they mistakenly rule about a particular detail like this, and the people follow this ruling and they start carrying, and the majority does that. In that case, because the Bet Din says patur, it's okay. In that case, the Bet Din is liable to bring a korban for that. If the Bet Din said there's no such thing as idolatry and the people follow that, the Bet Din is patur because people have to know better. But if they say there is a prohibition against idolatry in the Torah, but if someone bows to it, you're not liable. Only if you sacrifice to it, then you're liable. But just bowing to it, that's not a big deal, and you're not liable. If the Bet Din says that, and the people then, a majority of the people follow that ruling. Look, we just learned Masechet Avodah Zarah. There were a lot of details and complications. This particular thing is allowed. That is not allowed. The way that you worship it, the way they worship in the Bet HaMikdash. And so a regular person could easily make a mistake and say, well, I guess the Bet Din knows what they're talking about, and rely on it. And so if the majority of the people rely on it, then the Bet Din is liable to bring a pad he'alem davar shel sibur. And what's the source for this law? It says, if Ne'alam davad, if a matter is hidden, that means a particular detail of a law is hidden, but not the entire essence of the law. That's the whole mitzvah is hidden. No, that people have to know better. They have to know the basic 613 mitzvot, what they are, but only a detail of interpretation. If the Bet Din says is wrong, rules wrongly, then the Bet Din is liable. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, my tamad Rabbi Shimon, hoil b'reshut Bet Din hu oseh. Rav Yehuda says the name of Rav. What's the explanation for Rabbi Shimon? That is going back to the beginning of the Mishnah, that in a case where the Bet Din reversed itself, but the person didn't hear that they reversed, and he goes ahead and eats the cheleb, relying on the original erroneous law, then that individual does not have to bring a korban. Why doesn't have to bring a korban? The ruling was reversed. And the answer is because he didn't hear about the retraction, so he was relying on Bet Din. From his perspective, he's relying on Bet Din, so that's okay. Another version of what Rav said. Haomer hayar Rabbi Shimon kol hora'ah sheyasa berov sibur yachid haoseh ota patur lefi shelo nitena hora'ah ela labchin ben shogeg umezid. Rav says that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from the Mishnah used to say that whenever a ruling is issued and it spreads throughout the majority of the community, if an individual follows that ruling, the individual does not have to bring their own korban hatat, because a ruling is given in order to distinguish between shogeg. Shogeg means someone who thinks that this is a proper ruling, and he follows it. So, he doesn't know better. He's following this ruling. He doesn't have to bring his own korban because he's relying on the ruling. Even though, in general, a korban chatat is for a mistake, but that's a kind of mistake where someone doesn't realize today is Shabbat. Someone doesn't know. He never learned that this action is prohibited on Shabbat. Someone doesn't know that this is cheleb, but it really was. That's for a personal mistake. You bring korban. But here he's relying on the Bet Din. It's the Bet Din's mistake. So the Bet Din brings the korban. The individual does not have to bring korban. And the purpose of giving a public ruling is so that you can distinguish between someone who relies on the ruling and he's bishogeg and doesn't bring any korban versus someone who is mezid. He goes ahead and he's eating cheleb, and if there's no ruling that said it was permitted, then he's eating cheleb, then he's mezid. And therefore, the person who relies on the ruling, not having heard that the Bet Din retracted, but this person himself is relying on it. He thinks it's a true ruling. Me'tibeh, a challenge against Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, Rav's interpretation of Rabbi Shimon. It says here that if a Bet Din issues a mistaken ruling and the majority of the people follow it and they have to bring a pad, who pays for the pad? So here it says pad. This is called a pad, he'alem davar, for not knowing something that of the community. And also se'ir, if the Bet Din makes a mistake regarding avodah zarah, they have to bring a pad and also a se'ir. So these communal offerings that the Bet Din is going to offer for their mistake, they are paid for by the community. They make a special round of collection they go door to door, everybody come, you have to give $5, you give $5, and the community has to pay for this animal, according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Yehuda Omer mitirumat hadishkahen ba'in. Rabbi Yehuda says no. There's already a national collection of machasita shekel that pays for all communal offerings, korban tamid, korban musaf for the holidays. So we can take it from that. There's already a community. You don't need to make a special collection for paralim shadavar shel sibur. That's according to the Rabbi Yehuda. So now we see that according to the Rabbi Yehuda, there's not going to be any much publicity if the Bet Din has to bring korban, because there's no collection, because they just go and take from the treasury the machasita shekel that's already there. But according to Rabbi Shimon, they're going to go to door and say, oh, we need money. The Bet HaMikdash needs to buy a pod. Oh, why do they have to bring a pod? What happened? Oh, the Bet Din made a mistake. They said cheleb. They said this cheleb is permitted, actually is prohibited. So you see from the fact that the Bet Din, once they realize their error and they're going to bring a pod, they're going to make a public collection, everybody's going to get a bill in the mail, everybody's going to get a phone call, you have to contribute $10, and so everybody should know that the Bet Din retracted their opinion. So we ask, Amai, kevan degabelehu havele hoda. So according to the Rabbi Shimon, why would the individual be patur from a korban for relying on the permission of the Bet Din after the Bet Din already retracted, since they're making a collection? So that means it became known, and you're supposed to know. Where have you been hiding that you didn't get a bill? You don't know that they're collecting for this? You should know, so you should be liable for your own action after the retraction of the Bet Din. That's the question. A couple of answers. It could be that when they made the collection, they didn't specify what it's for. There's someone who went around, listen, the court, the Bet HaMikdash needs a special collection, a special fund. Okay, so people don't ask precisely what it's for, but something, happens from time to time. They need some extra funds, so he just pays it in, and the announcement doesn't say it's because of because of that ruling about the fat that they said last week. They didn't explain what it was for. Or it could be that this person was not in the city, and so at the time of collection of funds, and so therefore he missed the drive in shul that week. So he never paid it. He never heard about it. Or we could say that Rav, this is Rav Yudah name of Rav, who gave the explanation of Rabbi Shimon's opinion, maybe he follows the other memorizer, because there's another version of the Braita that has the opinion switched, and it says that they would make a special collection for Par Halim Davar Shel Sibur according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon's the one that says we just take from the money that's already in the temple treasury, and so if Rabbi Shimon said this, then that's why there's no publicity, because there's no special collection for it, and so that would be another way of answering that question. Okay, in the Mishnah we saw a couple of opinions, now a Braita that expands on them. Taneh Rabbi Meir Mechayev. Rabbi Meir actually says that someone who relies on the ruling of the Bet Din after the Bet Din retracted, that person is liable, because he's relying, it's true, in his own mind, he's relying on the Bet Din, but there is no such ruling of the Bet Din anymore. The Bet Din retracted, so he's relying on something that's false, and therefore it's his own mistake. So he's chayav. Rabbi Shimon says he doesn't have to bring it, as we already said. He doesn't bring anything. Rabbi Elazar Omer Safek. Rabbi Elazar says this is a case of uncertainty, and therefore we're going to explain that's going to be an asham talui. Mishum somchus amru talui. Somchus says it's suspended. Now, ironically, when he says talui, he means he's not going to bring an asham talui, and that's how we explain it right now. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, asham talui ika benayu. What's the difference between safek and talui? The difference is, would he have to bring an asham talui? Rabbi Elazar would say this is a safek, just like the typical case of asham talui is when someone has two pieces of meat in front of him. One is kosher, one is cheleb. He ate one of them, but he doesn't know which one he ate. So there's a 50-50 chance that he ate something that requires a korban chatat. But you can't bring a korban chatat unless you're sure that you made such a sin. And here he's not sure. So maybe one day, maybe his wife will remember at some point, or he'll find the packaging or whatever, and maybe one day he'll know. But in the meantime, he brings an asham talui that will suspend the punishment until such time, if and when he finds out. So that's a typical case. And so Rabbi Elazar would say here also, this guy, he relied on the ruling, but the ruling didn't exist because they're already retracted. Okay, bring in Asham Talui. And Sumcho says, Talui, suspended, meaning that his liability is suspended, and therefore he does not have to bring any korban, and not a chatat, and not even an Asham Talui. Amar Rabbi Zera, Mashal de Rabbi Elazar lemah davar domeh. Now, let's try to explain the Rabbi Elazar's opinion that he brings an Asham Talui. Why is he bringing an Asham Talui? Because he compares this case of the guy relying on the ruling of the Bet Din that was already rescinded is similar to the following case. It's similar to a person who ate something. That thing that he ate, he's not sure. Was that chelev or shuman? There's no way to find out. And then he realized at the time that he ate it, he thought it was kosher for sure. Later on, he realized that there's a 50-50 chance that it could have been that it was chelev. And he has to bring an Asham Talui because there's a good likelihood. It could be 50-50 or maybe there's more than one, more than two. But there's a good chance that he ate something not kosher. So if there's a good chance he ate something not kosher, he has to bring an Asham Talui. And here also, there's a good chance that this guy's guilty. We're not quite sure. He relied on this. He heard about it. He didn't hear about it. He should have heard about that the Bet Din rescinded. But maybe he was unavailable. It's likely that he is guilty, that he is liable, and therefore he brings an Asham Talui. There's a good chance that he is liable. And this ruling of the Rabbi Elazar that he has to bring an Asham Talui is true not only according to the opinion that says the congregation brings. Remember, we talked about this yesterday. Who brings the pot? Is it the judges or is it the tribal leaders, the leaders of the community? If you say it's the leaders of the community, where if the leaders of the whole community brings it, then it's going to have some more publicity, and the person should have known, because if there's something has publicity, that's your responsibility to know what was publicized. So then for sure he would be more guilty and have to bring an Asham Talui. That's for sure. But even according to the other opinion, it says the judges themselves are the ones that bring it, and in that case it will not have so much publicity. But if he asked, then they would have told him. So that it's less likely that he would be guilty. In that case, less likely than if it's the public. But even here, there's a good likelihood that he is guilty because he should have asked. Right? You have to ask around what's going on, what's the latest news, to be updated. And if you would have asked, then someone would have told you. So you should check up on things once in a while. And so now we have an explanation for Sumchus, who says that Talui meant that his liability is suspended. No liability. He doesn't bring an Asham Talui, even though Sumchus would agree that there's some chance that he should have known better, but the chance is very slight. So what is that like? לאדם שהביא כפרתו בין השמשות, ספק מבעוד יום נתקפל לו, ספק משחשיכה נתקפל לו, שאין מביא אשם תלוי. If a person brought a korban hatat, korban hatat is any korban is only valid during the day. If you bring it at night, it's not valid. Now, someone brought a korban for his atonement, and it was ben hashemashot, and therefore maybe it's during the day, and maybe an atone for him, and maybe the atonement came at night, but there's no atonement at night because it's invalid at night, and he's not quite sure if it's good or not. That person does not bring an Asham Talui because to make up for this the guilt that he had, because even though it's possible that he still needs atonement, but it's more likely that this was a good sacrifice. It probably was okay. And for the slight possibility that it was, in fact, after dark, we're not going to make him bring an Asham Talui. And so too in this case, this guy, he heard that the Bet Din said that this is permitted to eat. So he's relying on that. Now it could be that he really should have known that the Bet Din rescinded, but he didn't. So there is some slight responsibility, but not that much. And therefore, it's like this case where there's not so much responsibility and he doesn't have to bring an Asham Talui. And according to Sumchus, not only would he follow this opinion if you say that the judges are the ones that have to bring the korban, and there it's not so publicized, but even according to the other opinion that says that it's the leadership that brings the korban, and there, if the leadership have to bring it, then there's going to be more publicity, and someone would have told him, hey, did you hear, right, the leaders of the tribe, they went, had to bring a korban, here, for example, in the mashal that he gave, if it's he brought his korban, but it's not sure if it's day or night. And if he asked, he would not find someone to ask because only Hashem knows the precise moment that it goes from day to night. And so nobody would know, oh, what time was it? Was it 13 minutes, 13 and a half minutes, 14 minutes? And so it's impossible for anyone to know. And so also here, it's the Bet Din said it. Okay, the Bet Din made an announcement. This guy, was it his responsibility to know? Even if he asked, not everybody would know that the Bet Din changed their position. So it was somewhat difficult for him to find out. And therefore, even though he bears a little bit of responsibility, there's some possibility that he'd be guilty, but it's not so likely that he is responsible. And therefore, according to Sumchos, he doesn't have to bring anything at all. Amar lo ben Azai, Mai shena min hayosheb. Now, Rabbi Akiva said, it makes sense if the guy's away, then he has no way of knowing that the Bet Din rescinded, and he'd be totally patur. And Ben Azai said to that, what's the difference if he's away or if he's sitting in his house? The reality is that the Bet Din changed their mind, so there was no ruling for this guy to rely on. So it's just, he was relying on something that doesn't exist. So, according to Ben Azai, he should be liable wherever he is, whether he's away or at home. There is no permission for him to do this. He made a mistake. Let him bring a korban. And that was his challenge. And Rabbi Akiva answered and said, no, if he's away, then you have no possibility of hearing what the Bet Din said. If he's home, he has a possibility. He should hear it. So he didn't go, he didn't talk to anybody, he didn't ask around, he didn't go and hear the public announcements. So then he is responsible if he's home and he has to bring korban. If he's away, then we could say he relied on the Bet Din. The Gemara comments, Shapir Kamar le Rabbi Akiva le Ben Azai. Rabbi Akiva has a good point. That makes sense, that if he's home, then he should know better and he's liable. And if he's away, not. So how come Ben Azai didn't agree with that? Amarava hechazik baderech ika benaihu. Oh, in fact, even Ben Azai would agree that if he was already overseas, then he would not be liable. The machloket is an in-between category if he started going on the journey but didn't yet leave the city. Leben Azai chayav dahabebete ite. Ben Azai says, you're still in the city, so it's like you're still at home. There's still people around, there's still people to talk to, and you went and ate this chalev while you're in the city, although you started the journey, so that's not good enough, you're liable. Rabbi Akiva patur dahachazik baderech. Rabbi Akiva says he's not liable because he already set out on his way. When someone's traveling, even when they're already home, they're packing, they're busy, they're getting their donkey loaded, he's on the way, he's not thinking about the next thing that's happening in the city, he's not talking to anybody. So even though he didn't physically leave the city, mentally he's already started his journey, and therefore he would be exempt. We don't blame him for keeping up with what was going on in the city. Haru lo Bet Din la'akor et kol haguf. The next part of the Mishnah says that if the Bet Din issues an erroneous ruling that uproots an entire mitzvah, then the Bet Din is not liable to bring a korban he'alem davar shel sibur. Now we quote a braita that's going to more or less repeat what it already says in the Mishnah. Tenor Banan. B'ne'alam davar v'lo she'akor mitzvah kula. the pasuk says, if a matter is unknown, hidden from the bet din, that means a matter, but not the entire mitzvah, only some detail of the mitzvah. Kesad. What are some examples? Amru en nida b'Torah, en Shabbat b'Torah, en avodah zara b'Torah, yechol yehu chayavin tamud lomar v'ne'alam davar, v'lo shetit alem mitzvah kula, hare elu peturim. How so? If they say there's no such law as nida, there's no such thing as Shabbat, there is no prohibition against idolatry in the Torah, would the bet din be liable? The answer is no, because it says v'ne'alam davar, if a particular matter became unknown to them, and not that the entire mitzvah would be unknown to them, and therefore, if they issue a ruling saying that there is no Shabbat at all, they would be exempt. Aval amiru yesh nida b'Torah aval haba al shomeret yom keneged yom patur yesh Shabbat b'Torah aval hamosim reshut ha'yechid reshut rabim patur yesh avodah zara b'Torah aval hamishtachaver patur yachol yu peturin. If the bet din says there is a law prohibition against a man sleeping with a nida woman, but it does not apply to shomeret yom. If a woman sees blood for 1 day or 2 days and then waits the next day to make sure that she does not bleed again, that's shomeret yom keneged yom. If they say that a man is permitted to be with a woman during that day, that is an erroneous ruling about part of it, part of the laws of Nida. Or if they say that there is such a thing as Shabbat, but if someone carries from private domain to public domain, they are not liable, that's erroneous. That person is liable, but it's only one part of the mitzvah. They say there is a prohibition against idolatry, but it does not apply to someone who bows. If you bow to an idol, then patur, there's no prohibition. But it's not true. There is such a liability. So in all those cases, would the bet din not be liable? They are liable, because that's what it says here. V'ne'alam davar, if a matter becomes hidden from them, but not the entire essence. And here, the entire essence is known to them. Only one matter is hidden. Let's analyze this b'raita a little more. Amar mor yachol yehu peturim v'i b'kiyum miksat u'bitum miksat peturin ba'akedat kol haguf peturin b'may chayavin. The question is on the ending of the baraita, where we say that if they say that the one particular detail of Shabbat does not apply, then maybe they would be patur. The question is on this hava amina, before we quote the pasuk and say, no, they would be liable for a partial detail, when they say, can it be that they would be that they would be not liable, and if we didn't have the pasuk, then we would say that they are not liable. So we ask about this, a question stage. If when they say that there is such a law as Shabbat, but they just nullify one detail, they are patur, because that would be the havamina. And we already said before that if they undo the entire mitzvah, they are patur. Well, then they're patur in every case. So in what case would they be liable? You have a whole paragraph here that says they are liable when they forget something. So how does this hava amina make any sense to say that they're not liable when they mistakenly uproot the whole thing? They're not liable when they mistakenly uproot part of it. So then they're never liable. So what could possibly be the thinking at this stage? And the answer is Tana hachi kakashyale ema davar kulam mashma. At first they were thinking maybe the word davar in fact means that if they uproot the entire thing, maybe they're liable to bring korban when they uproot the entire thing, but not when they uproot only part of it. In other words, the opposite. Tamud lomar v'ne'alam davar. And so then they quote, no, it says v'ne'alam davar, and that means not the entire thing, only part of it. Now, how does v'ne'alam davar mean part of it and not the whole thing? In fact, davar could mean the whole thing. So we ask, my mashma, what do you mean v'ne'alam davar means part of it? Amarula karibe v'ne'alam mid davar. Ula says you have to read it as if there was an extra mem, and it says, mi davar, some of the matter was hidden from them. Chizkiah amar kera ve'asu achat mikol misvot velo kol misvot. Chizkiah says, okay, it doesn't really say mi davar, so you have to add a letter in, but I mean, you can understand it that way, but Chizkiah says, I have a better phrase. It's from the same pasuk, ve'im kol adat Yisrael yishku v'ne'alam davar, that's what we were just quoting, menakal ve'asu achat mikol misvot Adonai Shelot Asena ve'ashemu. They do of, here we do have a mem over here, from the mitzvot. And Chizkiah says, "Masu achat mikol mitzvot," that they perform some part of the mitzvot, mikol mitzvot, from a part of it, velo kol mitzvot, but not the entire mitzvah. If they uproot the entire mitzvah, people go against the entire mitzvah, then the bet din is not liable. We ask about that, mitzvot tarte mashma, but the pasuk actually says mitzvot in plural, and the minimum of plural is 2. So therefore the mem would say, from among the plural of mitzvot, let's say that means 2, so from among would mean 1, which means that they should be liable for uprooting 1 entire mitzvah. Okay, if they uproot 2 or many entire mitzvot, then that would be a different story. They'd not be liable, but they should be liable for uprooting 1 entire mitzvah, because that's all the mem would mean. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak mitzvat ketiv. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says the pasuk is written chaser. It doesn't have 2 vavs, in which case you'd have to read it mitzvot. It's written mitzvat, which is singular, although the way we read it is mitzvot. But since it can be read also mitzvat, so we're going to read it that way. So if it's some part of 1 mitzvah, therefore that is just a detail. So this law applies that they have to bring korban only if they erroneously omit a detail of a law, but not an entire law. Rav Asher amar yalif davar mizaken mamre. Dichtiv bezaken mamre ki pale mimecha davar lo tasu min hadavar ashir yagidu lecha yaminu smolma mamre min hadavar velo kol davar af be'orah davar velo kol haguf. Rav Asher has a third way that we can derive this fact that the bet din is only liable to bring pad helem davar shel sibur if they uproot part of a mitzvah but not whole mitzvah, and he learns it from a gezerah shava. It says the word davar here that we just saw, and it says the word davar regarding a rebellious elder, where it says regarding a rebellious elder, if the local bet din people don't know the law in their local town, then they go to the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim and they will issue a ruling, and then the judge comes back and he cannot veer from what they tell him, not right and not left. And says the word davar here twice, mimechad davar and also davar. So just like regarding the rebellious elder, we say, when is a rebellious elder liable the death penalty for going against the Sanhedrin? Only if he goes against a detail of a law, but not if he rejects an entire law. Then, although that's a bigger thing, but that he's going against the whole law of the Torah itself. So Torah will deal with them. It's more, and in fact, more dangerous if he rejects a partial, one detail or interpretation of a law and says, no, I disagree with the Sanhedrin, I think this way. That is actually more dangerous because people may follow him and it will be a breakdown of the entire legal structure. So that person gets the death penalty. And so that's true for Zaken Mamre. Once we know that, then we can apply through the Gezerah Shava that also regarding the Bet Din themselves, if they make a mistake regarding a davar, one detail, and the people follow it, then they are liable. But if they make a mistake regarding kol haguf, regarding an entire body of a mitzvah, then the people should have known better, and the Bet Din is not liable. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel En bet din chayavin ad sheyoru bedavar she'en hasadokin modin bo aval bedavar hasadokin modin bo peturin. My ta'ama zil kari be Rav Hu. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shemuel a very interesting limitation on the law of Horayot, that the bet din is only liable to bring a par helem davar shel sibur if they give an erroneous ruling about a matter that the Sadducees would not agree with. But if it's something that the Sadducees would agree with, it's a wrong law, but something that the Sadducees do, and they say a law that is wrong and is equal to what the Sadducees would say, then the Bet Din is not liable. The Sadducees were a group during the second Bet HaMikdash who interpreted the Torah more literally. They denied the oral law. They did not have midrash. And therefore, if the Bet Din says a ruling, and basically it's an explicit pasuk, then the Bet Din is not liable. Why? Because it's so easy. You could go learn it in elementary school. In elementary school, they just learn Chumash, and they'd read it and learn it by heart, learn the Peshat. We get to know what their educational system was also of the rabbis. So when kids kids were in school, they would learn the words and the basic understanding of the words, which is how the Sadducees understand it also. And therefore, if the Bet Din says pig is kosher, well, pig is kosher, that's a pasuk. The Sadducees would agree that pig is kosher, and therefore the person who hears that ruling cannot say, oh, I'll rely on the Bet Din. You can't rely on the Bet Din when it's an explicit verse that says pig is not kosher. You have to say, no, the Bet Din, I don't know, something wrong. I'm not going to eat the pig. I'm going to stay away from it. So the individual is responsible, and therefore the Bet Din is not responsible. They are patur. So what's so interesting about Shemuel's statement here is that when the rabbis want to figure out what is called the peshat, the simple, literal, straightforward meaning, and what is midrash, that's dependent on the oral law and its methodology, how do you know which one is which? Well, one, you could ask a child, but they don't say that, or they don't just have a criteria of, read the words. Rather, they say, go ask a Sadducee. See, if they have this law, then, and the Sadducees keep all the laws that are explicit in the Torah. They keep them very seriously. And we know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have some of the literature that is related to the Sadducees. So go ask a Sadducee. If he would agree with that reading, that means it's a simple reading of the Pasuk. Tenan. Yesh nida b'Torah aval haba al shomeret yom keneged yom patur. Now we're going to challenge Shemuel from our Mishnah that says, if the Bet Din says there is such a law as Nida, however, regarding Zava, if a woman sees one day blood and then the next day she's watching to make sure that she doesn't see that blood, the correct halacha is that she's prohibited to be with her husband. If the Bet Din would say, Patur, the husband can be with her, then that Bet Din has to bring a korban. Ve'amai, shomeret yom keneged yom, haketiv ve'safra la, melamed shesoferet ehad le'ahad. Why would the Bet Din be liable in that case? After all, this law of that if a zava sees blood, then she has to wait another day is explicit in the Torah. It says she will count. Now, if she sees 3 days in a row, then she'll have to count 7 days. If she sees one, she'll have to count 1 day. But it says in the Torah, yes, she will have to count, meaning during that time, she has to count to make sure she's clean, that she doesn't see any blood during that time. So that's explicit in the Pasuk. That's something that the Sadducees would agree with. And therefore, according to Shemuel's principle, the Bet Din should not be liable. And yet, this is the example in our Mishnah where the Bet Din is liable. So the answer is the Amre ha'ara'a sharia gemar bi'ahu de'asira. Oh, we're talking about a case where the Bet Din says, what's prohibited? To be with a nida only if it's a full act of intercourse. But ha'ara'ah, that's just the beginning of the act, just the crown of the male member enters into the nida. The Bet Din says mistakenly, in fact the halacha is even that initial stage is prohibited, but they say, the initial stage is permitted, and it's only the full act that's prohibited, and this is something that is not explicit in the Torah, and so that's a part of a law for which they would be liable if they said that. But we reject that. That actually says regarding a nida, it says that if a man is with a nida, he has uncovered her fount. And that word for uncovered is ha'ira, same word as ha'ara'ah, which is the meaning of the initial stage of penetration. And so that is basically explicit also. So the Bet Din should not be liable if they say this mistake, because it's an explicit pasuk. Damri kedarka asira shelo kedarka sharia. All right, another proposal. The Bet Din is liable when they say that if someone has relations with a nida in the regular way, then that's prohibited. But in the unusual way, meaning anal intercourse, then that is permitted. Right? It doesn't say anything in the pasuk about that. It just says to sleep with. So how do we know how to define that? So if the rabbis here say a partial law that's wrong, and it's something that's not in the pasuk, that's when the Bet Din would be liable. But we reject that too. Haketib mishkebe isha. It says regarding homosexuality, if a man is with a man in the way one lies with a woman, and it says mishkebe in plural, from which it's actually a midrash. I don't know if this is so explicit, but that there are two ways of lying with the woman. And that's from front and back. So we learn from here that, in fact, regular and shelo kedarka are considered sexual acts. And if one does either one with a nidah, both would be prohibited. So the rabbis are considering this to be explicit, something that the Sadducees would agree with, because it says mishkebeh. Even though I'm not sure really if that's the Peshat, it's more like a Midrash. But in any case, here is treating that as the Peshat, because otherwise, why would it be plural? So another proposal, Damri kedarka asur afilu ha'ara'a, b'shelo kedarka gemarbiyahu asur aval ha'ara'a sharieh. We're going to combine the two proposals that we just said. And the Bet Din says, if one sleeps with a nidah in kedarka, the normal intercourse, and that's prohibited, even the initial stage. But if you combine the two weird ones, that shelo kedarka from the back, and then only full intercourse, but the beginning of intercourse with shelo kedarka, that is permitted. Ha'ara'a with shelo kedarka, that would be permitted. That's what they say. That's the mistake. So that's not clear, because each one by itself has a pasuk, but that both together, maybe both of these unusual ways of sinning, maybe if combining them, that's permitted, and so that's when the Bet Din would be liable. We challenge that. If that was the case, then the Mishnah could have said this case regarding a nidah. It doesn't say the case regarding a nidah. It says shomeret yom keneged yom, which is talking about a zava, and says, oh, zava, she was a zava one day, and they say it's permitted on the next day. Okay, so even if they say it's permitted in a case where it's shelo kedarka and ha'ara'a. But if that's the case that they were talking about, they should have just said nidah. Why they have to pick the more unusual case of a zava that's shomeret yom keneged yom? And so this is not accepted as the answer. So forget all that. We're talking about regular intercourse. And the Bet Din is liable when they say that this initial intercourse, when is it prohibited? Only for a nidah, but not for a zava. After all, the pasuk that we quoted before, et mikora he'ayra, that's said regarding a nidah. It's not said regarding a zava. And so this would not be it's explicit regarding nidah, but it's not explicit regarding zava. Now the true halacha is that ha'ara is prohibited for a zava also. But if the Bet Din says, it applies only to nidah and not to zava, that's mistaken. It's not something that the Sadducees would agree with. It's not explicit in the pasuk. That's the case where the Bet Din would be liable, because it's only a hint, something hinted to based on the oral law, not explicit. That's one answer. Or Mishnah, when it says shomer yom keneged yom, it could be talking about where the Bet Din rules that a zava only becomes a zava when she sees blood during the day, when she can see it. Because if you read the pasuk explicitly, literally, it says all the days of her discharge, which means it's only considered a discharge if it's during the day, and that makes her prohibited. But if she sees blood at night, then she would be permitted. If the Bet Din says that, that's wrong. In fact, if she sees blood anytime, day or night, she becomes a zava. So this is something that an explicit reading would lead you to the wrong conclusion, and therefore it fits into the principle that Shemuel taught, that if it's something that the Sadducees would agree with and the Bet Din makes a mistake, so then how's the person supposed to know? He reads the pasuk, yep, it says that. Kol yemeh, makes sense only during the day, so they would reasonably follow that the Bet Din, so the Bet Din is liable. But if the Bet Din said something like that there's no zava law, or that there's no shomer yom keneged yom at all, there's no accounting of clean days, that it says in the pasuk, there the individual has to read the pasuk and know himself that the Bet Din is wrong, and since the person is liable for himself, the Bet Din is not liable to bring a korban. Okay, now another challenge against Shemuel from Shabbat, Tenan. Yesh Shabbat b'Torah v'hamosim reshut l'reshut patur. The Mishnah gave an example of when they contradict a part of a law, is they say there is such a thing as Shabbat, but if you move something, carry something from private property to public property, then that's allowed. If there's no punishment. If the Bet Din says that, they're uprooting part of a law, and that's where the Bet Din would be liable. Now we ask, Ve'amai, according to Shemuel, why should they be liable in that case? Hosa haketiba, lo tosiu mishmasa mibatechem. It says in the pasuk in Yirmiyah. It's true, we don't usually learn halacha from Nevi'im, but here is, you could say Yirmiyah is just explaining what it says in the Torah when it says al yetzeh ish memekomo. Maybe it means al yetzeh al yotzi. Don't go out of your place. Don't take something out of your place. In any case, this is interesting because the Dead Sea sect and the Sadducees, other sectarians, actually would learn halacha from Nevi'im and Ketubim. Okay, in any case, this is still explicit pasuk. So even if generally we don't derive halacha from Nevi'im, but the people know Nevi'im, and so they'll know there is a pasuk in Yirmiyah, right? I'm sure when they're kids, they learn all of Tanakh, including Yirmiyah, and they should know that there's a pasuk that says you can't take something out of your house on Shabbat, and they should go and look it up and see where the source is from the Torah also. And they would know that this is prohibited. And therefore, the Bet Din should not be liable in this case because this is something explicit in Tanakh, and that's something that the Sadducees would agree with. So the people should know better. The Sadducees wouldn't say that you can carry from domain to domain on Shabbat because the Sadducees have this pasuk in Yirmiyah. In fact, in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Damascus document, it has a law that you cannot carry in or out. So the Sadducees actually, we know explicitly, do agree with this law. So what is this example in the Mishnah? Really, this doesn't fit with Shemuel's criteria. And the answer is, if the Bet Din says, oh, you're not allowed to carry from private domain to public domain, because that's what's explicit in the pasuk. But going from public domain to private domain, that it doesn't say so in the pasuk, so that would not be obvious to everyone. And there, if an individual followed the Bet Din, then the individual would not be liable because he's following the Bet Din. How's he supposed to know better? And there, in that case, the Bet Din is liable. That's what it's talking about. Our another answer. The Bet Din admits the true law that carrying something out or carrying something in is prohibited, but what if you don't carry it out? You stay inside and you just stick your hand out and give it to someone who's outside, like the Mishnah Berachot, or you throw it from the private domain to the public domain, or the other way around. If the Bet Din says that's permitted, so then a person might say, well, I guess I should follow the Bet Din, because yes, I know the pasuk in Yirmiyah, but the pasuk in Yirmiyah just says don't carry it out. That means if you're carrying it in your hand and walking outside, but just to stick your hand out or to throw it, it sounds like, okay, that's permitted. And so this is something that would fit into the criteria of Shemuel. Even someone that knows Sadducean law, even someone that knows the Peshat of the Pesukim, may very well say, yeah, this Bet Din law makes sense, and therefore the individual is not responsible, the Bet Din is responsible. And finally, a challenge against Shemuel. From the last example, the Mishnah of Avodah Zarah Tenan, Yesh Avodah Zarah Batorah Aval Mishtachaveh Patur. If the Bet Din rules, there is a prohibition against idolatry, but someone who bows to it is not liable. In that case, the Bet Din is liable if they say that. Ve'amai hamishtachaveh haketiba dichtib lo tishtachaveh le'el acher. What do you mean? Bowing down to idols is an explicit pasuk. It's in the Ten Commandments. It's also later on. In Shemot 34, do not bow down to another god. So if the Bet Din says, oh yeah, you're allowed to bow to another god, that's something that the Sadducees would not agree to that. Even a Sadducee, even a child would know that this is a wrong ruling, and therefore the individual should be responsible and the Bet Din should not be liable. So why are you calling this just, how come this example is in the Mishnah according to you, Shemuel? And the answer is, Damre ki asira shtachavaya kedarka, aval shelo kedarka sharia. No, they could say, the Bet Din could say, yes, we know this pasuk. This pasuk is talking about where this is the normal way of serving a certain idol. If there is an idol where the normal way of serving it is to bow down to it, that's when it's prohibited. Just like anything, if the normal way of serving Mercury is to throw stones at it, then throwing stones at it is going to be prohibited. But this prohibition of bowing down only applies to cases where that's the normal way But if it's not the normal way to serve this idol, then it's permitted. Now, this is actually not the halacha, because we saw in Masechet Avodah Zarah that anything that would be done in the Bet HaMikdash, one would be liable if they did that to an idol, including bowing. But this is something that is not explicit in the Torah, because the Bet Din could say that only applies to an idol whose normal way to worship is by bowing down. That's answer number one. Or if the Bet Din says, bowing down, even if it's the normal way of that idol, when is it prohibited? Only if you do bowing down by totally prostrating oneself, extending arms and legs totally on the floor, totally flat. That's what's prohibited. But if you unbows without extending arms and legs, a lesser bow, then they say it's permitted. Now, in fact, the halacha is that it's prohibited. But this doesn't say explicitly in the pasuk exactly what type of bow. So that would be an example that fits with Shemuel's criteria. This doesn't go against the Sadducees. It doesn't go against the Peshat. A person listening to that wouldn't know better. Can't blame him for saying, okay, well, the rabbis must know what they're talking about. I know it's not allowed to bow, but they say bow only means total prostration, but it's allowed to do less than that. So people might follow it, and then the people are not responsible, because how would they know better? And that's why, in such a case, the Bet Din is responsible. Rav Yosef has a follow-up question that we are going to use the previous discussion to try to answer. En charisha b'Shabbat mahu. If the High Court comes and says there is no prohibition about plowing on Shabbat, mi amri mahu? Mi amrinan kevan deka modu bechulahu milata ki bitul miksat v'kyu miksat dameh. Do we say that on the one hand they agree that there is such a thing as Shabbat, so they're agreeing to the generality, and they're only saying this one milacha of plowing is permitted, so that would be included in the category of accepting part and denying part, and therefore the Bet Din would be liable for giving this ruling? Or do we say they are nullifying an entire category of plowing? Do we see plowing as its own mitzvah, as its own complete goof, its own body, and they're undoing that, and therefore we said the principle, if they undo an entire body, then the Bet Din is not liable. So do we see all of Shabbat as the body and each melacha as just one part, and therefore they are liable? Or do we say that each melacha is itself a whole body of law? Tashema. Let's try to answer it. Yesh nida b'Torah aval haba al shomeret yom keneged yom patur. Ve'amai ha'akriyan l'shomeret yom keneged yom kol ikar. Well, we can prove from the example that the Mishnah itself gives in another area, where if they say there is such a law as a prohibition against a man sleeping with a nida, but if someone sleeps with a zava, who saw blood for one day, then for sure that day is prohibited. How about the next day? If the Bet Din says that the next day is permitted, then they say patur. If someone does that, then the Bet Din is chayav. Now, why would the Bet Din be liable if they say that? Aren't they uprooting the entire body, or the entire category of the law of shomeret yom keneged yom? And so, if that was true, that we treat this whole thing as a body, then this law wouldn't make sense. They should be not liable, but the Mishnah says they are liable. What do you see from here? That we look at the whole big general category of nida laws, and nida and zava laws as one big category, and therefore this subcategory of shomeret yom keneged yom is considered only a part, and that's why the Bet Din is liable. And therefore, if we apply that back here, we will see the entire Shabbat is one category, and the prohibition against plowing is a subcategory that is considered accepting part and denying part. And that would be the answer. Yes, they would be liable if they say that plowing is permitted on Shabbat. That seems like a good proof. However, Amar lach Rav Yosef, Shomeret Yom Ka'amrinan Kedeshanin. Rav Yosef could say, no, that's not a good answer to my question, because this example of Shomeret Yom is as we just interpreted it in the previous sugya, where we said it's not just a simple case of Shomeret Yom Keneged Yom is permitted, but rather it's where the judges say that ha'ara'ah, the initial stage of intercourse with a Shomeret Yom Keneged Yom, that's what's permitted. So they're actually not permitting the entire thing. They're only permitting one subcase within the law of Shomeret Yom. And maybe that's why the Bet Din is liable. But in fact, if they said there's no such law as Shomeret Yom Keneged Yom, then that would be considered a whole body, and they would not be liable. So no proof from there. Let's try again. Tashema. Yesh Shabbat b'Torah, aval hamosim reshut hechid reshut rabim patur. V'amai ha'akriyan lehosa'a kol ikar. This is actually a very good proof for answer to Rav Yosef's question, because it's about Shabbat. And as Mishnah says, if they agree there is a prohibition of melacha on Shabbat, but carrying from private to public, that is one is patur if they do that. If the Bet Din says that, then that's an example where the Bet Din would be liable. Why should the Bet Din be liable? Aren't they removing a whole category of hotza'ah? Isn't that a whole body of law? But the Mishnah does not say that. It says that the Bet Din is liable because we consider Shabbat to be the major body, and one whole area melacha, one of the 39 melachot, is considered a detail. So too, plowing would be a detail, and if they say you're allowed to plow, then the Bet Din would be liable. Isn't that a good proof? No, not a good proof. Hatamname kidshanin. Here also we can explain this part of the Mishnah as we did in the previous section. The previous sugya, that's not talking about actually carrying something from domain to domain, but rather throwing something or handing something out, which is a detail, a subcase within this category. So it could be if they would say no plowing at all, then that would be not liable, because that would be a whole category. And it's only if they say a certain type of plowing like this, a certain type of carrying, that would be a detail, and that in that case they would be liable. So no proof from here either. Tashema yesh avodah zara b'Torah ava mishtachave patur amay v'ha'akriyan la'shtachava kol ikar l'shtachavaya kol ikar. Another proof from if the Bet Din says in the Mishnah says if the Bet Din says there is avodah zarah, but bowing is permitted, Bet Din would be liable in that case. Why should they be liable? Aren't they uprooting an entire law of bowing? And so they should be not liable because they abolished the whole law. But the Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah says they are liable because we consider idolatry to be the big category, and hishtachavaya, even though it's a whole category of law, is considered a subcategory. It's a detail. And so too, regarding Shabbat will be the whole law, and if they say Shabbat is prohibited but plowing is permitted, then they would be liable. Like this case, isn't that a good proof? And we say here also, Amri hishtachavaya name kedeshani, and we have to interpret this Mishnah. We can interpret this Mishnah as we did in the previous sugya, that it's not that the Bet Din said that all bowing is permitted, but rather they say, the only thing that's prohibited is bowing totally prostrated, but if you're not totally prostrated with hands and legs outstretched, then it's permitted. So they are in fact saying a certain detail is prohibited, a certain detail is permitted. That's what the case of the Mishnah is talking about, and therefore there is no final proof from this Mishnah to answer the question of Rav Yosef. A question by Rabbi Zera. And Shabbat b'Shivi'it mahu. What if the Bet Din comes and says, during the Shivi'it year, when you can't plow the land anyway, so there's already a prohibition against against working the land. If they say there's no prohibition of Shabbat, if you would work the land during the Shivi'it year, you'd be violating Shivi'it only, but you would not be violating Shabbat. Shabbat applies 6 out of 7 years, when on 6 days you can, and then on the 7th day you can't plow the land. But during the 7th year, when you can't plow the land at all, then Shabbat, there is no such thing as Shabbat. It does not apply. Now, what about that? Would we say that is considered abolishing Shabbat totally, because you're abolishing Shabbat for that whole year? Or do we say that, no, they are saying there is Shabbat, there's Shabbat 6 years. They're only abolishing part of the law because they only abolished it for 1 year. Okay, so let's see. How would they make such a mistake? What are they misunderstanding? They'd be misinterpreting this pasuk. Beharishu bakasir tishpot. Bizman deika harisha ika Shabbat. Bizman deleka harisha leka Shabbat. Now this pasuk says that in plowing and in harvest you shall rest, which means that on Shabbat you have to rest from plowing and harvesting. You can't do plowing and harvesting on Shabbat. But they interpret it as follows: Beharish, during a time when you normally can plow and harvest, meaning during 6 out of 7 years, then there is a prohibition of Shabbat. But when there is no time, when it's not a possibility, when you're not allowed to plow and harvest during the year, meaning on the Shavuot year, then there's no mitzvah of Tishbot, there's no mitzvah of Shabbat. So that is a possible reading of this pasuk. And so if they say that to people will say, oh, that makes sense. I know it says Shabbat, it's one of the 10 commandments. But here, look, they just interpreted this pasuk to mean Shabbat applies, but 6 out of 7 years. So that's our question. Do we consider that time factor to be partial or whole? Mi amrinan kevan de mekayamin la bish'ah sheneh shavua kibitul miksat ameh. Do we say, since they do say, admit that there is Shabbat, and 6 out of 7 years, so it's considered admitting that to the whole, yes, there is such a thing as Shabbat, but they're nullifying only part of it, only a detail, 1 out of 7. And therefore, the Beit Din would be liable. Or do we say, since they're totally uprooting Shabbat for that year, there's no prohibition of Shabbat at all during that year, do we consider that as uprooting the entire essence of a mitzvah? And in that case, the Beit Din would not be liable. Good question. Maravina tashema navi shenit nabe lakor davar midivre Torah chayav lebitul miksat ulkiyum miksat. Rabbi Shimon Omer Patur. Ravina says, I can learn it from the law of a false prophet, where a Braita teaches, is if a false prophet comes and he uproots an entire matter of Torah, then he is liable for, as a Navi, sheker, and you have to kill that Navi. But if he just says that a detail of a law is nullified, but the rest of the law remains the same, according to Rabbi Shimon, that Navi is patur. Okay, that's the general rule. So now this is good because it's another category. We have a similar distinction. But then the Braita continues and says, Uba avodah zara, afilo amar hayom ovdal machar batela chayav. Regarding avodah zara, that's different from all other laws. It's going to be more stringent. Even if the Navi says, today you should worship this idol. Tomorrow you should destroy this idol. So now, he is accepting part of it and rejecting part of it because it's a time factor. Today it's okay to worship idolatry. Tomorrow, go and destroy it. Even though this is part and part, still that Navi is liable. But this is an exception to the rule. Normally, if it was, do something today and don't do it tomorrow, like if a Navi said, keep Shabbat this week, don't keep Shabbat next week, then he would be patur, because avodah zarah is the only exception. In all other laws, saying something applies a certain time and not a certain time, that's considered partial uprooting. Shema amina in Shabbat b'shevi'it ki bitul miksat v'kim miksat dameh shema amina. So we can successfully learn from this baraita that if a Beit Din said there's no Shabbat during the Shavuot year, so they're only uprooting part of it, and they are accepting Shabbat as a whole, because it applies to the rest of 6 out of 7 years, and therefore the Beit Din would be liable in such a case. So we do have an answer for Rabbi Zera's question. Next Mishnah, Horu Beit Din v'yada echad mehen sheta'u v'amar lahem to'im atem. If a Beit Din made an erroneous ruling, but one of the judges said that this is a mistake. You guys are mistaken. This is a wrong ruling. So really, they should have listened to that and said, oh, really, it's wrong? Why? And checked into it. And then they probably would not have made an error, but they just ignored the warnings of that one judge and said it anyway. So that detracts from the authority of their ruling. And in that case, if they were warned, and they give the wrong ruling anyway, and people follow it, the Bet Din is not liable. Or if the most distinguished member of the court is not there, really, in order to be a proper session, you should have all of the judges there, including the Chief Justice. He should be there. If he's not there, well, if he was there, then maybe he would have corrected them. So when he's not there, then that also detracts from the authority of the ruling. And since it's not a totally authoritative ruling, the people that follow it are following something that is has a deficiency, and therefore the Bet Din themselves are not liable to bring the Pad Elim Shel Sibur. And the third ruling, O Shehaya Echad Mehen Ger, O Mamzer, O Natin, O Zaken Shelo Ra'ui Lebanim, Hadeze Patur, or if one of the judges was a convert or a mamzer or a natin, a descendant of the Givonim who tricked Israel, or elderly, so elderly that they're not so sharp. You could read this as a different case, ozaken or if he is not able to father children, and so these are various categories of people who are not proper to be judges if they don't have children, so they're not going to have the compassion that a father learns. And the other ones also, we're going to see the derivation in a second. And so, because one or some of the judges were disqualified to be judges, so their ruling was not authoritative. The people followed a ruling, but it wasn't an authoritative ruling, and therefore the people are liable, and the judges are not. Hadeze patur shene'emar kan ha'eda v'ne'emar lehalan eda ma eda amura lehalan kolan ru'in lehora'ah af eda amura kan ad shiyu kolan ru'in lehora'ah. How do you know that in this case of the Bet Din making a mistake in ruling, that all of the judges have to be on this level of genealogical perfection? Because it says here the word Aida, and it says regarding when the people judge someone who is a murderer to see if he's a murderer bishogeg or not, it says also the word Aida. And just like over there, all of the judges have to be fit for issuing ruling themselves. So too, Aida here has to mean that all of them are perfect judges, fit to rule themselves, and over there, people with these genealogical problems could not be judges. So too here, they are not proper judges. If they're not proper judges, then their ruling is not authoritative, and therefore the Bet Din does not have to bring a Pad Ha'elim Dabar Shel Sibur. Gemara says, "O shelo haya muftesh Bet Din sham min elan." Now, if the Supreme Court justice is not there, the Chief Justice, then it's not an authoritative ruling. How do you know? What's the source? Amar of Sheshat v'chen tana debe Rabbi Ishmael mipnei ma amru horu b'davar hasadukin modim bo peturin mipnei shehaya lahem lilmod v'lo lamdu lo haya muflash Bet Din sham na mepeturin mipnei shehaya lahem lilmod v'lo lamdu. So here, the Tana, a Baraita from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, explains that based on the reasoning for another law that we just saw. If the Bet Din issues a ruling at something that even the Sadducees would say, that's wrong, you can't say that this thing is permitted, it's an explicit pasuk. If they say a mistake that is so obvious, then the Bet Din is not liable. Why is the Bet Din not liable? We offered one explanation, that it's the individual people, they should know better because they went to school, they learned. But here's a slightly different explanation. It's because the judges themselves should have learned. They should have known better, and they didn't. And therefore, their ruling is not authoritative because it's such an obvious mistake. And if it's not authoritative, then the people that follow it are following a non-authoritative rule, and so the judges are not then responsible for them following such a rule. So too, we can apply the same logic here. If the Chief Justice, the smartest of them, is not there, also the judges are not liable because they should have learned from him. They should have said, wait, the Chief Justice isn't here, the most distinguished. We should really ask him first before issuing a ruling. If they don't, then that makes their ruling not so authoritative. If it's not so authoritative, then people follow it, so it's not their fault. They are not responsible to bring a korban. Now the Mishnah went on and said that they cannot have, and the judges cannot have any of these genealogical defects. And it brought a proof, a gezerah shava, from here to the judges in a case of a shogeg murderer. Now, how do we know that in the case of shogeg murderer, all of the judges have to be of a perfect lineage? Da'amar Rav Chista Amar Kera, v'hityasebu sham imach. Imach bedomin lach. We learn it from the story when Moshe Rabbeinu said, "I can't bear you all alone," and he appointed 70 sages, and Hashem said that they may stand there with you. What do you mean with you? It means similar to you in the sense that just like Moshe did not have any genealogical issues, so too the 70 elders have to be like Moshe, not a mamzer, and not any of these have any of these problems. They have to be perfect lehora'ah like Moshe. Wait a second. How do you know the word imach in this pasuk means that they have to have the same genealogical perfection? Maybe it means that they are with you, that they will reach divine, have Shekhinah come upon them like you. They have to be worthy. Maybe it's spiritual worthiness, not genealogical worthiness. Ela amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar Kera v'naseu itach bedomin lach. Rather, another pasuk from Parashat Yitro, where there Moshe also appoints people to be judges to help him out, and it says they will bear the burden of the people and their judgments with you. Bear it with you. And here it means with you, similar to you. It's not talking about the Shekhinah resting on them, so you can't say imach for Shekhinah, but rather here it means with you, similar to you. So too we learn that judges have to be like Moshe without genealogical imperfections. And from the Gezerah Shava, we will learn from here that the law of Horayot, that the Bet Din has to bring a korban, only if they all reach this level of genealogical perfection. Last Mishnah for this daf. Horu Bet Din shogigin v'asu kol hakal shogigin mebi'in par. If the Bet Din mistakenly gave a ruling, they didn't know, they thought that this was a proper ruling, and so they made a mistake, and the people also made a mistake in following their ruling. In such a case, that's the typical case where the Bet Din brings a par ha'elem davar shel sibur. However, next case, mezidin v'asu shogegin mebi'in kispa u'sa'ira. If the Bet Din purposefully gives the wrong ruling, they know this is wrong, they know this thing is chelev, and anyway, just some kind of, they're not very nice judges, not very pious, but it could happen. They are the judges, and they say, this chelev is kosher, knowing that that's wrong. And the people follow it. In that case, the people are following a ruling that's not an erroneous ruling. I mean, it's a false ruling, but it's not, the judges didn't do it by mistake. So in that case, the people, individuals, they have to bring their own personal korban hatat, which is a female lamb or female goat. And it's not the Bet Din themselves, they don't bring a korban hatat because they did it b'mezid. You don't bring korban hatat for sinning b'mezid. So their punishment will be even worse. V'shogigin v'asu mezidin hare'elu piturin. If the Bet Din issued a ruling by mistake, they didn't know better, and the people, they actually did know better. They knew it was a mistaken ruling, and they followed it anyway, then they are exempt. They're exempt from being korban because the people themselves, they acted b'mezid. So you don't bring a korban if you act b'mezid, and presumably, since it's not the majority of the people that followed their ruling, the Bet Din would also not have to, if it was not a majority, then the Bet Din also would not have to bring a korban. Gemara, shogigin v'asu mezidin hare'elu piturin. So quoting the last case in the Mishnah, where the Bet Din gave a ruling by mistake, but the people followed it on purpose, meaning knowing that this is cheleb and is prohibited, and they ate it, but it's not because of the authority of the Bet Din that they did so. So that's called mezid, and they are not liable. So what can we infer from this? Hashogeg dumya de mezid hayav. If they did it by mistake, but it's close to mezid, then they would be liable. What does that mean? Shogeg dumya de mezid vechidame sharu Bet Din shecheleb mutav nitchalef lo beshuman v'achalo. Let's say the Bet Din said that this certain cheleb is permitted, and this guy, he was not intending to eat that piece that the Bet Din ruled about. He was there's two pieces in front of him, and he was intending to eat the one that's totally kosher. And so he reached out his hand, trying to take the one that's totally kosher, and ended up taking the other one. And so he ate the thing that the Bet Din said is kosher, but really is not kosher. So this is shogeg. He's shogeg because he didn't intend to eat that piece at all. So he wasn't relying on the Bet Din's permission. He was relying on the fact that he didn't think he was eating it at all. So he was not relying on the Bet Din's permission, and he made a mistake. So since it's his own mistake, maybe he should be liable because he wasn't relying on the Bet Din. And so the Gemara says, yes, that should be true because, look, since the Mishnah says, Shogigin v'asu mezidin, ten piturin, if this individual purposefully, knowing that this is chelev, ate it, and because he knew that the Bet Din was wrong, in that case, he's not liable because that's called mezid. But if it was less than that, less mezid than that, and that would be this case where he intended not to eat it at all, and then he ate it because he took the wrong one. He intended to get the kosher one, and he got the non-kosher one, but he wasn't relying on the Bet Din. So this is closer to mezid, then he would be liable. He would be liable to bring a korban because he made a mistake, like any mistake. If it was definitely cheleb, and there was two pieces, one definitely cheleb, really is cheleb, and the Bet Din, everybody says cheleb, but one kosher, and he mixes them up, and he eats the cheleb by mistake, so he brings a korban. So this is similar to that case because although the Bet Din said it's permitted, but he wasn't relying on the Bet Din. So we should learn that in such a case it would be chayav. If so, then we should be able to use this source to answer the question of Rami Bar Chama that he asked all the way back on Daf Bet. He asked about this very case, and we had different conclusions. Rava said this way, Rava said the other way. We rejected both of those proofs, but how come we didn't bring this proof? Amalach mishum de Tana Resha mezidin ve'asu shogigin, Tana Sefa shogigin ve'asu mezidin. And the answer is no, you cannot derive anything from the language of the Sefa because the Sefa just uses this language because it's continuing the style of the first one. The Resha says mezidin, it's the middle actually, the mezidin ve'asu shogigin. So I wanted to give a case where the Bet Din issues a wrong ruling on purpose, and the people not knowing that follow it, so it brings that language, and so now it wants to use similar language, and so it switches around the terms, shogin vasu mezidin. But it's only using the language to continue the style, but you cannot infer something particular from this language, and therefore, in fact, there is no way to answer Rami Bar Chama's question from this Mishnah. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.